Alissa Bennett has lived many lives. Maybe that is why she can speak for the dead. Alissa is and has been a fashion model, an author of some of the most delicious and niche zines imaginable, an invaluable character in the New York art scene, a cultural critic and fan, a coveted university lecturer, a co host of the addictive podcast, The C Word, which I did not turn off for weeks straight when I was first introduced to it, and a woman of unapologetic wit and paralyzing elegance. There are few mediums and milieus within the variegated trenches of culture and its artifacts which Alissa has not examined under the magnifying glass of her bleeding heart. And what is it that this heart bleeds for? Alissa loves the most unlovable women. She does not love them from a place of pity or superiority. She does not love them from a place of grieving their potential or neglecting their flaws. She loves these reviled and exiled women from the blistering throne of utter humanity, from a body sundered with unrivaled empathy, where she matches her morbid curiosity and critical analysis with the capacity to see evergreen beauty and value, even the most ephemeral of lives. Sublime Beasts is about monsters and the people who love them, the people who create them, the people who study them. When I reached out to Alissa, I was eager to speak with her about the cultural artifact of the woman as abomination, the hysterical and the deviant, the monstrous woman. Not something with massive incisors and covered in fur, but a terrible specter who hides in plain sight, a fleshy humanoid aberration that defies the expectations and ideals of a society wherein, despite progress, strict mandates still define what a good woman is. Alissa and I initially connected over this love of bad women who we found very good, very real, very brilliant. Supernovas who burnt dark holes where our eyes once were, leaving the shadow of their lives to haunt the marginalia of our minds. Because of this, it is my supreme honor to have her as the inaugural guest of this passion project. We are very lucky to have a chance to learn from her unparalleled and incisive love. Welcome, Alissa.
Sasha, I feel like you just read my soul.
Oh,
Incredible.
that's my other job, my other career pursuit and
Interested
passion.
to know. Yeah.
Yeah, I was when I was originally planning this, I kind of bandied back and forth between like, should it be a short and sweet kind of introduction? And I was like, what have I ever done that was short and sweet? It must be like saccharine and over the top and like Shays Lounge esque in
Love it.
evocation.
I love
So
it.
awesome, amazing. Okay, so really excited to talk to you. I mean, when I was originally planning like what I wanted the first four kind of episodes to be, this was the first one that came to mind. I reached out to you like months ago before I even reached out to anyone because I knew I had to do this. And well, I think that like symbolically and iconography wise, this project carries a lot of the sort of cosmic horror, body horror, sci-fi horror related imagery that I use to promote or talk about. I really think the formative love for me is like the idea, especially having been a teenage girl once in my life, of like the utter monstrosity of the feminine experience, right? And I knew the first monster had to be like the one that hides in plain sight. It had to be like the human expression of womanhood and the way it gets tangled and skewed and mutated and caught in the gnashing teeth of culture. So I want to start off by asking you, what does the word monster mean to you within the context of your life's work with maligned women? I mean, maligned people, celebrities in general, but especially within the context of women.
Mostly women. Yeah. I think the concept of the monster is such a sort of significant placeholder because it is how we kind of mitigate our anxieties socially. So you have the reviled figure that is then the container for everything we're afraid of, everything that, we've structured our morals or our ethics around. And I think women are a particularly, I think, even going back into this idea of body horror,
Yeah,
I think uh, y- women as, like a physiological object, it's
totally.
a very convenient container to put these anxieties in. So I think that when we construct the female monster. It's really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about this lately because I'm working on a new season of our podcast that's sort of constructed around the idea of the reviled mother, which
Love
is
it.
the sort of ultimate cultural monster. There's almost nothing worse that you can be called
Yeah.
as a woman than a bad mother. And I started really thinking about it because I was like clicking through Amazon Prime in the morning doing my makeup or something. And there was a documentary that's not terribly old. It's maybe, I don't know, 3 years old about Jean Ramsey's mother.
Oh my god, yes.
And I thought, isn't this just incredible that this deceased woman who's been, sort of wed to this very this crime that has so inflected American culture for the past 25 years or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Isn't it incredible that we still need to mine her as a container? We still culturally need to kind of wander through her
Totally.
corridors in order to serve our own anxiety. Personally, I've always, for a long time anyway, thought that that murder was an intruder. And that's not a
Mm,
popular opinion, but
yeah.
it really fascinates me that we still live in a culture where all of the focus gets dumped into, like I said, the reviled woman, the reviled mother.
I, I'm really excited by that too, because then we even get the sort of dichotomy where we can make the daughter, right? Because it's usually a daughter, the sort of victim. We can make her the innocent in the situation, whether that's with Jean-Benet Ramsey, whether it's like Gypsy Rose Blanchard's another one that immediately comes
Mhm,
to mind within the
mhm,
sort of um cultural, like, spectacle of the bad
mhm,
mother, but, I mean, this is ancient too, right? This is, like, biblical Herodias and Salome as well, like,
mhm.
we go back to the inception point of the mother as the monster, as, like, the capital W witch, right?
And even going into, the sort of more contemporary reading of it and talking about different kind of capital, the idea that women were reviled or controlled primarily because it was a measure to police patrilineage, because
Mm,
the biological internal system that you can't see, you can't determine who the father, it's like
yeah,
this sort of state gesture in order to avoid having bastard children or
yeah,
having children inheriting property that is not theirs,
yep,
ancestrally. So it's all of these things that are, it's like a real morass, I think, that I don't I think something that you and I have in common obviously is, I think we've both made it our lives work to try to untangle that and follow
yeah.
that thread. But it is a very complex system that traces back, to the beginning.
Absolutely. I think one of the things too that what I really love, especially in the way that you address this work, is that you're able to acknowledge the way in which, like, m- the monster of society, culture, like Moors, right, plays a role, but you don't defang the monstrous woman of the ways in which she's still monstrous, right? Like this is not a either or, it's a both and where we can totally have this mutually frenzied feeding between, like a makes me think of Bataille's like every like cannibalism beginning with a kiss, right?
Right.
There's this two parties that are both going to devour each other in some way, and each is pointing a finger at the other as the perpetrator of that kind of blasphemy or heresy.
Absolutely. And I think that when we pick the remote body, when we elect the remote body or the woman who we don't know, the infamous
Yeah,
woman, to be the monster or to be sort of the stand-in for all of our anxieties, those anxieties are, they're pertinent to us because I think we relate to whatever the impulses are to commit crimes
yeah,
or to transgress or to cross the boundary. And that's why, culturally, women sort of end up with a double dose of it, because I think women
yeah.
in particular, we're sort of in many ways in many ways culturally very responsible for how this plot line continues to play out
Yeah.
because we are the primary consumers of things like true crime. We are the
Yeah.
primary consumers of tabloid culture. We are the primary consumers of celebrity gossip. It's there's all of these things built into it where it does become this sort of system of self-identification, but it's also a system, in a purely semiotic point of view where you think, oh, but I've thought about it, but you did it.
Yes.
Like I've thought about killing my boyfriend, but here's someone who actually killed their
Did
boyfriend and
do it,
not
yeah.
contradicts us.
Yeah, I mean, that brings to mind, like, a question I had for you, which was how much of that fascination I mean, there's so much internalized misogyny in this, right? Like, you're even bringing up who is the main consumer of this? Who is the first to turn on a woman for being monstrous? It's usually another woman, right?
Mhm,
And how much of
mhm.
that is also if I point the fingers at you, if I call the attention to you, if I other or kind of showcase you as the perpetrator of this monstrosity, this otherness, this transgression, people will not acknowledge, recognize, or see these things in myself, right? Like I will be redeemed. How
Yeah,
many, the people that pursued the witches during the witch hunt, that was the perfect cover up for if you actually were a witch, right? It's
and
her.
you get to proclaim your innocence, I think.
Yeah.
By seeing, and identifying via vision, you get to be innocent.
Or whatever innocence maybe yeah, means in this
Right.
context, right? That sort of like superficial lacquer that maybe
Right,
coats us for a
right.
little bit until it wears off and exposes our own
Exactly.
grotesqueness, the inevitability of it. What do you think, like, as far as the prototypical and maybe I wanna make a distinction here between the, diagnostic criteria, though antiquated, of the hysterical woman as opposed to, like, the cultural idea or artifact of the hysterical woman. I mean, this is something that, regardless of time period, I mean, we see this thrown around now. Um, we see this show up with like Britney Spears also being a really great example of like a contemporary exposition of it and the way in which people use this idea of hysteria as a way of just diminishing or dismissing some now these real complaints that we are recognizing were legitimate, right? But for a while were avoided. How do these themes tend to arise within the women you've researched? Like this affliction of emotions that can't escape the body, that show up in these when they show up, it's usually when they become very prominent or observable to us. Like what's the theme there that you've tended to recognize?
I mean, I think that there's a couple of different paths that it can take because I'm also interested in and maybe I'm going to call them unmanageable women. I think
Ugh,
that
love it.
women who can't be managed stir major anxiety, and there's different paths that it can take. I think with celebrities, I've said many times on the podcast, and I really believe it. I believe that if you look at a PET scan of a starlet's brain,
Yeah.
someone who's been famous for decades or whatever, that the brain function would look different. I think that intense scrutiny as well as intense fame
Yeah.
are physiologically damaging, and I think that it's this sort of intense pileup, the secretion of attention and pressure and desire, and this sort of these acts of theft that we
Yeah.
commit, because I do think that culturally we steal from these women. Our attention
Mm,
is a kind of theft. And I believe very sincerely that if you were to do a very basic survey of, say, the Disney starlets who have gone off the
yeah.
the rails, there doesn't necessarily have to be some common, domestic trauma or relationship trauma or, innate mental illness. I think it's something that we cause by virtue of our hunger for them.
Mm,
Um, and certainly it happens, culturally to regular people in different ways. But, I think it's at the core in both instances. If it's, an infamous person or a famous person, it's, our cultural reaction to witnessing someone lose control. I
yeah.
think that's too frightening for us.
I
Yes.
think that's a really, like, prescient point too, because in a lot of, I think the documentaries that come out, the scare title-y kind of articles that come out, there's this real desire to try and pinpoint some formative developmental trauma. We look immediately for not that, they're inseparable, because there are many cases too where, like, early developmental, like, sexual abuse or, neglect or physical, like, all of these things absolutely can be catalysts, right? But I really appreciate you bringing up this distinction where in many ways it can be the relentless, parasitic eyes of the
Mhm.
audience that create this really, powerful kind of, I mean, this is body horror, right? Like, this is
Or straight.
the the public as an infestation that possesses the flesh of
Mhm.
a person and begins to contort it. It's a type of panopticonism that changes you from the inside out.
Which in a way is what, I have this sort of sub fascination where I'm really interested in sort of very abject celebrity memorabilia.
Yeah.
And it can range from, a lipstick or a bra,
Yeah.
or there was a point where all of this, someone that was in Britney Spears' inner circle had found all of these old love letters and
Oh,
underwear,
wow.
maybe like an ex-boyfriend, and brought them to the market and they were sold. And it always fascinated me, how, for me, when I look at these objects, there's some kind of psychic force in them that feels like
Yeah.
necrophilia. It feels
Yeah.
like, the great fantasy of having access to the body of the beloved, the
Yeah.
star, the celebrity. People close that distance down without consent by having an object that their body touched. And it's often,
Yeah.
the when you get outside of very famous objects like dresses that were in, famous films, or, things that are identifiable culturally, and it's just the detritus of someone's life, it's
Yeah.
often the most abject of these items that ends up kind of accruing the most surplus value, which I have thought is really interesting. And it just kind of,
Absolutely.
for me, has always indicated that there's never enough. It's a really cannibalistic, to go back to your
Yeah.
point about Matai, it's very cannibalistic, corrosive, necrophilic relationship that we have with celebrity.
It brings in this whole idea of, like, the extent in which we purchase intimacy or steal it, right? Like,
Mhm.
even if you are buying a little literal item, you're not stealing it. I mean, the ways in there's still an issue where you consider consent, right? Like, did that celebrity willingly part with that particular thing?
Yeah,
Probably not. I mean,
and we do it
the
to male celebrity in a different way, which is fascinating to me also. If you look at, there are a lot of message boards that are dedicated to, sort of early deaths in, like, the matinee idol,
mm,
um, sort of
yeah,
construct. So Brad Renfro or River Phoenix, or
yeah,
and I think that when women get obsessed with a male celebrity, it often tends towards, the expression of that obsession is more literary. So there's like a lot of
yeah,
funny fan fiction that spins out of
yeah,
it. It's not so object oriented, but it is about, again, about this intimacy with someone who no longer has agency. And it's
yeah,
very complicated, but I think very intact metaphor for how these figures circulate, what their purpose is culturally, what the purpose of celebrity or infamy is culturally, what we can
yeah,
extract from it.
absolutely. I mean, on that same kind of body horror note, do we see this trending toward, I think about the body modifications that we see, the disordered eating, the self-harm, the relentless surgeries. I remember, having this moment the other night. We went to see the Kill Bill double feature, and I was watching all the actresses and being like, they each have really distinct and unique faces, and, like, things that I would look at and that aren't imperfections, but my brain now, after seeing the same kind of, like, Instagram model face over and over again, was like, "Wow, like, Thurman's interesting looking, right? Like, what's going on here? I mean, that's terrifying, and that also feels like something out of a science fiction horror kind of
It
concept
it's
as well.
it's so Twilight Zone-y. I feel the
Totally.
same when I watch even films from the '80s or
Yeah,
'90s and you look at an actress's teeth,
yeah,
and they have, like, legitimate, real, unaltered teeth, and it's
yeah,
so much more human, and sexier and, like, more interesting
yeah,
than this thing that is, like, and maybe there is something I actually teach a section in my Yale class about this new drive towards, this sort of homogenized plastic surgery
yeah,
phase where it seems to me that as we kind of incrementally retract from real life and we're more attached to the idea of living on the screen, these modifications that happen to the face are not modifications that look normal if you walk down the street, right? Like they're
yeah,
all done, all of this contouring, even with makeup, contouring makeup, or, these sort of prosthetic flourishes, they're made for digital life, which I think is also kind of body horror, right? It's like the horror of actually living in your body in real
yeah,
time, real space, because we prefer
totally.
something that's truncated into two dimensions, which is really fascinating. And I think kind of relatively new um, form of mental illness. It's just
Totally.
fascinating, weird, very weird.
It's just a wild, like, inversion of, like, of the narcissist story, right? Where,
Mm, mm,
um, we only identify with the thing we're gazing into. I see and I experience myself all these moments where I'm like, "I know what I look like based off of taking my selfie or angled in the mirror in a certain way," and then someone shows me a photo of myself, or I rewatch, like, the videos of me speaking, and I'm like, "That can't be me! I'm a monster. I'm terrifying. I was pretty sure I didn't look like this," and it creates this wild I mean, I can't maybe imagine a time in history where body dysmorphia was probably more, like, routine to a place of almost, like, mundanity, right? Um, and that in itself, I mean, we have a lot of we see in, the horror genre, a lot come out of that, but I think it's barely even been able to scratch the surface because the thing that's supposed to be at the perimeter of our nightmares, right? That we're pulling into and we're like, wouldn't that be a weird and spooky reality? Is actually just the reality of a thing now. It's scarier to
yeah.
imagine something outside of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just on the other side of the glass now.
Yeah, and I mean, which one of us is us, right? So many of us would end up choosing the other side of the glass self over
I mean,
the
I think that when you see, a woman in public who's so drastically altered her appearance that it no longer looks human,
Yeah,
it's because she chose the digital proxy, right? Like
yeah,
that's the more satisfying place to live.
yeah, it's fascinating, and every time that I start to feel, because I'm a deeply flawed person, and I'm, like, neurotic and critical and a million other delicious, juicy things, but in particular, I notice that, like, I will feel this sense of revulsion or judgment come up when I'll see someone who's done that to such an extent, but, then I spend the rest of my day, like, staring in a mirror, imagining that I had, like, a knife that could cut off different parts of my like, of the
Well,
f
right.
I'm like,
This
"Oh, it's
this
she
goes
did
really
it," right?
goes really full circle to the
Yeah,
conversation we were just
yep,
having about, how can you find, I don't know if empathy is the right word, but how can you find some point of contact with a stranger who's done
yeah,
something that might on its surface seem unimaginable, but is actually
totally.
just sort of the apex that peaks in the culmination of all of these
Absolutely.
experiences that pushed her towards whatever
Yep.
the action is.
Yeah, it's absolutely that, like, well, I may have thought about it, but she actually did it all
Yeah.
over again, and it's almost funny to think about, in a especially in, American, culture, there's such an emphasis on the active over the passive, right? It's interesting
Mhm.
to think of this sort of, flip where we are actually privileging, which also speaks to a lot of weird, woman issues, quote
Oh,
unquote,
yes.
privileging the
Yeah.
passive over the active, right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, again, Um, and we're getting into Simone de Beauvoir, I guess, here in a
Yes, yeah,
little bit of Paglia, but just physically, the
yeah,
interior versus the the projected physically.
yeah. I God, it brings up so much too of something we see all the time within the kind of trope of the monster that we see so much time in horror genre literature, but also in film. It comes to mind too for me in particular, in Videodrome, right? This idea of like a feminine limit experience being in a passive place, in a need to receive, instead of being the one
Yes,
perpetuating
yes,
to a point where death is the ecstatic moment, to receive death, to be freed
yes.
of the boundary of, like, what the body has caged or incarcerated
Mhm.
the spirit
And
within.
to, like, explode, I think there's a lot in here that is even connected to, body modification and, like and you
Yeah,
kind of said it earlier, but even, like, exercise
yeah,
or, what's the potential of the body and what's the limit of that potential and what happens when you cross it, right? It's death.
yeah,
Like, when you reach the
totally.
absolute potential of the body, you cross over.
And there is no, I mean, we lose sight of the boundary. We lose sight of the horizon until we have fallen over
Mhm.
it. I
Mhm.
remember my trainer recently, when we were taking a break, from an exercise, and he was like, "Well, have you noticed, changes in physique or blah, 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 blah?" And I was like, "Look, buddy, look, dude, pal, friend, I can't see myself accurately for shit. Like, I need that reflected back to me because I'm either going to see something like sometimes I'll see something that looks much better than it really does. A lot of times it's much worse, but it's like
Yeah.
never really an accurate reflection,
No.
right?" And he was like, "Ah, yes, welcome to the gym. All the people you see and you're like, sure wouldn't mind having that body are doing that same
Right.
thing, right? Like, are seeing something monstrous about them too." It makes me think from from a folkloric I mean, the amount of different types of weird miasmic kind of spirits that could feed off of the dysmorphia that we experience as a result. I mean, it I am not a conspiracy theorist, but I understand where some of the propaganda of the blah blah
Yeah.
comes from,
Oh,
because
yeah.
it's the snake eating its own tail a lot of times.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I often think that conspiracies are just like it's like a conflation of circumstance, right? It's just like all the
Yeah,
right circumstances sort of pile up so that something looks possible, which I think, as human beings, we're always looking
pattern
for what's
seeking. Yeah.
possible. Yeah.
There are so many examples of women who try to run away from, right, and avoid this monstrous reputation or the label we seek to place on them. And then there's also women who like really lead into it and own it and kind of revel in it. And I'm curious what you think makes the difference in how someone responds to that sort of categorizing.
I think it is probably quite rooted in how comfortable a woman is being seen.
Mm,
Like as a woman who's not terribly comfortable being seen, and I'm quite secretive in my way, and I don't want a lot of attention. I think, a lot of the figures that I've been attracted to, I've seen that in them too. Like I've seen how they arrive at a circumstance because they're secretive or they
yeah,
can't express themselves or there's some kind of entrapment and immediately who comes to mind when you look at the inverse of that is someone like Courtney Love who's
yeah,
quite there's something it's not like a Teflon because I don't feel that she sort of sheds those criticisms off or
yeah,
sheds that judgment off, but I think that she is able to absorb them in a way that is somehow positive for her. It's
yeah,
a different I believe it's in how comfortable you are being regarded, how secretive you are and how um able to accept criticism for being yourself you are. I think it's about
Yeah.
your relationship to visibility in a lot of ways.
Yeah. That makes sense. It's the can you be nourished by your cultural egregor being fed any way whatsoever? Like, do you have that very Oscar Wildean any attention
Right,
is good attention?
right,
Where I mean, we know with Oscar Wilde, we know with Courtney Love, like it took a toll. No one's happy being maligned that way, especially the kind of accusations that have been leveraged against both of them.
right.
I wonder how much it's like a survival instinct too. But I mean, if you can
Mhm.
learn how to metabolize and like feed on even the people who disavow and malign and all that kind of vitriol, I mean, why wouldn't that make you more of a monster? That's scary. We don't want that. Like you can't survive our criticism. How dare this like make you
It's
richer, make you
exactly.
more
I mean,
popular?
exactly, and I think that that, you know, it becomes a kind of circuit because I think that when we witness that in someone, especially in a woman, it doesn't happen so much with men, but when we witness someone who is able to sort of add our ire into their drives,
Yeah.
it instigates more ire, you know, so
Yeah.
it becomes sort of, again, the snake eating its tail. It becomes this
Yeah.
loop, um, where we, you know, we perpetuate if Courtney Love wants to be seen how she is culturally or not, it's going to perpetuate that because I think she's a useful figure for us. She's a
Totally.
useful container for us culturally and socially and emotionally.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you think if the monstrous woman lives long enough, like there's a tendency, a trend, or even a possibility toward like redemption, like a transition out of that monstrosity, or is it more like a permanent, like branding that mutilates the soul?
It's funny, I've been thinking about this also, and I've been thinking about it in relationships to Gypsy Rose Blanchard,
Oh
who,
my god, okay,
yeah,
give it to
you know,
me.
also a little bit Britney Spears. I think that because we culturally don't accept these figures as human in a
Yeah,
lot of ways, we're not very cognizant of the fact that, you know, public opinion takes its toll. So I look at a figure like Gypsy and I am always interested in dissenting opinions. So I think, you know, she starts out and I think there's this sort of mixture of people who feel incredible empathy for her and people who
mm,
feel like she got away with murder. And then she, you know, there's this sort of press blitz and she gets out of prison and everyone or most people are like, look at Gypsy Rose living her best life.
yeah,
She's come back and have a great life free. And then you look at what's happening now, and there are these undercurrents in the dialogue about her
yeah,
where people are saying, actually, I think she did kill her. I think that she was responsible for this crime. I think she's actually a really terrible person. I think all this attention is going to, you know, drive her over the edge to manipulate somebody else into doing a crime for her. So I think we like to resuscitate and deflate women over and
totally.
over. So
Yeah,
yes, there is redemption, but I think the redemption is also it's often very fragile because once you've redeemed the once reviled figure, they're complete. And we don't like that. We don't like something that is done, right? Because then you can't mine anything else from it.
totally. Oh my god, I have never thought of it that way, and it's so cool because it brings in this whole, like, necromantic aspect
Oh,
of
yes.
right? Like, I need to be able to kill this beast over and over again, but it is the thing that I also need alive because my role is in killing it, and so I need to bring it back so I can kill
Yes.
it again because it's actually me that has the murder fetish, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's actually
Yes.
me that
Yeah.
has the problem with that thing.
Yes. And I think it's, you know, there are certain, you know, I've been doing a lot of research into women who murdered their children, or who
Mhm.
are accused of murdering their children. And there are certain cases where I think there's some kind of flash of clarity where we're able to say, oh, leave Andrea Yates alone forever. Like this is a woman who, you know, from my perspective and the perspective of many, this is an abused woman who was kind
Yeah,
of forced into having all of these children, horrible postpartum depression, living in a bus. She murders the kids because she's they're you know, the family was involved in this sort of traveling ministry that essentially sent faxed flyers to their congregation that would
Mm.
have a literal drawing of a witch, and it would say women are witches and they're going to infect their children. So we look at her and we're like, all right, we
Yeah.
can kind of understand how this happened. But then there are other figures like JonBenet Ramsey's mother, Patsy Ramsey, where because there's an element of like we don't I think in a lot of ways we don't want that crime to be solved. We kind of collectively, I would love to solve that crime personally, but we don't
You
want it,
specifically, yeah.
me.
Yeah,
We don't want it solved because then it's like the toy is broken,
yeah,
right? It's like the all of the grotesque drama of that murder
yeah.
gets kind of extinguished if we know what happened and there's no water in the well left. So that's a figure who I think will be, I'm certain I'm not the only one that looks at this case and says that woman didn't murder her child.
Mhm.
And so there will be people that kind of try to redeem her, and then it will get crushed back. It's like a balloon, someone breathing in and out of a balloon.
It's fascinating because it is what you're bringing up too with, again, with this mother complex of the revulsion we have, like, the almost inherent monstrosity of a mother who deigns to retain her own life or to receive attention. Like,
Or
the
even
mothers
childbirth, like
yeah,
starting with childbirth, that
yeah,
it's something monstrous about it.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, when we think about how often mothers that are animals in nature devour their young too, right? I mean, we shouldn't be affected as much, I think, by the way in which we can sometimes see similar behaviors come out. I mean, of course, it's I'm not let me clarify for anyone listening to this. I am not in favor of infanticide. I don't think it's like a cool
Anymore.
thing. Yeah, I don't, um, but when I think about, like, the stage mom, right? Or, like, these mothers that are because they had a child, their whole life is about the child now. Like, we already know from the history of psychoanalysis, all the sort of complexes that are assigned to the way the mother especially is gonna interact with a daughter suddenly receiving the attention, right? Even those, like, kind of like folkloric adages about like, oh, when the daughter's born, she steals all the mother's beauty, right?
Right. Right.
The idea that the mother is going, like the daughter will triangulate the relationship between the mother and the father. Um, but then we also don't give mothers the chance, like accolades for really being anything other than mothers. So of course they're gonna try and get fed or nourished or weaponize attention toward themselves through the daughter. I mean, Munchausen by proxy is like the most obvious condition in the world that could arise from a society saying like your identity is now just mom, right? Like it doesn't get to
And
be.
I wonder if I wonder what the epidemiology of Munchausen by proxy is. If it's usually, I mean, it's typically women, right? Like
Yeah,
men are not,
I can't
medically
think of any
neither.
famous cases off the top. No.
Yeah. It's really interesting, and I wonder if it's usually daughters. I mean, I know of one case off the top of my head where it was a mother and a son, but I'm very pressed to think of more than one.
Yeah. I mean, I think we go back to that. I think that that sense of scarcity that's, like, ingrained into how women circumnavigate the world, right? And that this is, like, a thing that I've heard come up in conversation over conversation, whether it's academia, whether it's in like, in a with public figures in spotlights, this sort of this competition that there's only so much, right? It's already hard
Right,
enough to get the barest as
right,
a woman.
right.
Every other woman there is a threat to your ability to do this
Mhm,
thing for yourself. I imagine too, right? Having those own feelings on an unconscious level about your own child, you
mhm.
can't address those very easily, right? It's that same thing as a Lacanian real, like, you can't look at it without going crazy. It's
Right.
psyche annihilating to be like, "Actually, I'm super jealous of and, like, wish my daughter would go away because she's getting more attention than me." Because when you say that out loud, it sounds terrible, right?
Terrible, but it's probably not a terribly uncommon scenario,
No.
and I think now, there's like this huge rise in criticism of the boy mom. Have you read anything about this?
No. Oh my god, tell me about the boy mom.
Boy mom. Of course we, go dirt biking. It's like this sort of pseudo
Pick
romantic
me?
undertone of a relationship between mother and son that
Okay.
has become sort of culturally entrenched now. Like people are not.
Fascinating.
It's like when women have little boys and they dress them in a way that would be like when I had my son generationally, I would look around and I'd be like, oh, all these bitches who are my age are dressing their little boys like the skateboarders that they were in love with in
Oh
high
my god.
school,
Yeah.
and it's very, you have to look it up because it's quite interesting,
Yeah.
as the sort of partner of this very well researched phenomena of
Yeah.
mothers and daughters and
Yeah.
whatever the
I mean,
sort of psychosexual tension is there in that relationship.
almost even the mothers that compete with their sons as girlfriends, right? When they become introduced. Well,
Yeah.
he's never gonna love you as much as he loves
Yes.
me, right?
Yes. Yes.
And all of these things get they we don't like to talk about them really,
No.
right? Because it's there's enough stacked against women to begin with that it almost feels like doing like all of us dirty sometimes to talk about, right? The complexes, the issues, the problems, the whatever the fuck is going in that makes these complexes arise. But it also is, I mean, I think it's one of like the weirdest, coolest things in the world, right? It's super fascinating to me the ways in which the mind bends back on itself in order
Mhm.
to justify or allow for like I always come back to Jurassic Park with the nature finds a way, right? Kind of like the mind will find a way to justify
Well,
some
it
terrible and
will.
monstrous thing when it is backed against a wall.
It will. And I think also if we don't talk about it the way that you and I are talking about it now, we inevitably talk about it in a different kind of way that's more
Yeah,
damaging. Like it doesn't, just because the thought isn't expressed rationally, it doesn't mean that the thought isn't expressed.
totally. I mean, can you think of even like many examples where women that were sort of cast this way and in this light were able to escape that reputation in their I mean, in the
I
cultural
think
media and the tabloids?
it becomes your
Yeah,
reputation. I mean, the one
yeah.
that obviously just comes to mind immediately is Joan Crawford.
Mm,
Like who cares about
yeah,
Joan Crawford's, legendary career as an actress? She's
yeah,
camp and
yeah,
she's a child abuser. That's
yeah,
that's what we distill, and men get off in a different way. Like
yeah,
in a lot of my research recently, I've done quite a bit of old Hollywood research based on these auction lots. And you look at a figure like Clark Gable, who was accused by Loretta Young of rape that resulted in a child. And it's
yeah.
a story that, nobody knows. Nobody talks about all of these things that get sort of secreted away in
Yeah.
the masculine realm, and in the feminine or female realm, it becomes the metonymy of the person. The mistake,
Yeah.
the error or the flaw becomes the person.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
And maybe
they're the tools of worship in the temple for that celebrity.
right, or maybe in some way it's like, "Oh, now I can see what's inside of you," going
Yeah.
back to the anxiety of the
Yeah.
uterus being,
Yeah.
seated inside the body. When you encounter the monstrous deed, you think, "Oh, it's not a mystery anymore. I know what's in you."
Yeah, and if we feel like we have any kind of understanding, we feel like we have some kind of control over the thing, and therefore we are more powerful, right? To make sure that it doesn't spread to us, that we don't
Right,
become the next
right,
carrier, the next it
right,
follows kind of thing about that, right?
right.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I 'Cause I think about even within, like, the context of Courtney Love, who now I mean, for a while before she deleted social media, most of what she was posting when she wasn't, like, exposing big pharma was just, like, her doing mantric stuff, right? Like, her pursuing a different like, her Buddhist path and studies, talking about fashion, blah, 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 and then every 3rd comment, you killed your husband,"
Yeah,
right? It's like
yeah.
this she is, I mean, everyone is, I have very strong feelings about her. A lot of people obviously have very strong feelings about her, but I think, you can look objectively and say she has come a long way from other places in her life, but that's
Well,
not
and
gonna.
also I think you can look objectively and say this woman did not murder her husband. It's
Yes.
another
Yeah,
one
yeah,
where it's like, and I think part of, why she continues to be such a significant cultural figure is for the same reason that we can't, um, that belief that, well, maybe she did it keeps her
yep,
resuscitated. It keeps the balloon
totally.
full and we can poke at it.
Yeah, we can't stand to see that maybe she is breaking out of the mold that we have put her in. I mean, also that she chose and reified for herself in many ways too, right? Like there is there is like a weird kind of complicit unspoken agreement between the gaze of the public and the particular celebrity that like we need you to be this way and we will keep you famous if you are
Mhm.
this thing, and then being that thing because they know that's, and when they try to break with what we have as far as an expectation for them. And I mean, let me scale it back because this is very, very true, I think, for like macro celebrities, but even for smaller micro celebrities or public figures in different niche cultures. If you see a musician that, he's always
Mhm.
done this type of music and he's like, well, I'm going to put out a folk album. Everyone's like, oh, fuck
Dare
you.
you? How
We
dare you?
agreed that you were going to do Midwest hardcore for the rest of your life,
Oh, right.
Like,
Because the cultural figure is a mirror, right? Because they're supposed to reflect the perfected version of the fan back to the fan self,
yeah,
in that circuit. When the reflection gets altered, it feels like a violation. I think people
yeah.
feel violated. And it even happens physically. Like I've noticed, I don't know if you are the kind of intellectually lazy person like I am, and I read the Daily Mail every day, and
I get the alerts like every 10 minutes on my phone.
me too. Okay,
Yeah.
so I've noticed this thing that they do over and over and over now is they'll show typically a female celebrity of the past who has not been in the public eye for some time. And it will be like, can you guess who this unrecognizable female
Yeah.
celebrity is? And it's like the physical alteration is a violation to us. We feel
Yeah.
violated by it because it also indicates that we too are aging, right? It's like
Yeah.
when you see that time is progressing and you've missed the steps of that progression, so the result comes as kind of a surprise.
Yeah.
You're like, "Oh shit, I'm also 15 years older than I was when that movie came out." It's
Yeah.
it is an incredibly parasitic relationship like you said earlier. Absolutely.
And we have exceptions, right? They're caveats. I think what Christina Applegate is maybe an exception where I feel like people have decided, okay, you're undergoing this terrible disease. It's beyond your control. Like you're allowed to change on us. But if it, God forbid, it is someone's vanity, quote unquote, right? I think
Right.
that's already like a really weird thing because we are projecting this idea on of vanity onto someone who's been told that their whole livelihood depends on them maintaining a certain appearance, right?
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, the superhuman need to punish people that have disrupted our perception of the way things should be is extremely evident, even when it's for the better. We're, I think, less harsh when we think someone's done surgery that makes them look better, unless
Yeah.
they've done something else, right, that upset us, and then we're like, "Yeah, you got your chin done, though,"
Right.
like
Right. Like
pony.
it's a moral. I've been reading the Jameson Reddit
Mm,
boards a lot, and she's going through something again.
yeah,
But I found that a lot of the criticisms are not rooted in things that she's done, but it will be like, you have to be a really terrible person to end up with eye bags like that. And I was like an eye bag is a fucking moral
yeah.
failure. Like that has, it's really incredible that it's still, we haven't progressed past that yet.
Yeah, I mean, with higher and higher expectations of the exact prototype of what a face is supposed to look like now. I mean, I
50-year-old
can't.
you know? It's like
Yeah.
it's this monstrosity of aging. The aging woman is also a monster.
And you're allowed to age in visible ways as long as it doesn't break other rules, right? Because
Right,
you'll see certain actresses, Susan Sarandon, Jean Smart, lauded for that, but you're also only allowed to play certain roles too, right?
right,
Like the backlash around Anne Hathaway in the new film where she's supposed to be the older women with the young musician partner, right? Where it's also like, okay, first of all, Anne Hathaway is literally perfect look like, and she does not look like a demonstrably older woman. I think the one with what Julianne Moore,
right,
and
right,
that was a little. They did a little bit more of an accurate job depicting what like a visible difference might look
right,
like. But like, oh, you can play that kind of role. You can't have that kind of life, right? There, and even then, that role, there's something wrong with that woman, right? We get
right,
to feel good. We get to get, oh, why does she think she deserves that?
right.
Which
Yeah, I think
we don't see that
that's
with men.
that's a lot of, why does she think she deserves that? I think that that's
Yeah.
like the secret mantra of our culture.
How does our cultural eroticization of shame and this like kink for vicarious humiliation influence the story of like factory farming of the monstrous woman?
I think that it is this sort of eternally compelling archetype. I think, and it's funny, going back to our discussions about Hollywood, because I think we've we've evoked Hollywood several times. It's sort of like within the entertainment industrial complex, there always has to be a figure who fulfills a certain kind of type, right? So you
Mhm.
have the starlet, you have the bad boy, you have the family man. There's always these slots that need to be filled in order to sort of cover this full arc of personality types that we sort of anticipate in the real world. And I think the monstrous, again, it, there is a sort of discrete industry, specifically the tabloid industry, that sort of revolves around keeping this archetype alive, fed, full of blood, because culturally we feed on it, we depend on it so intensely. And I think obviously now, and it has been this way, of course, since the beginning of Hollywood and since probably the beginning of time in terms of our interest in the other, it's just a position that always has to be filled.
I think that is so prescient, right? Like it, and I love that it actually gives it a sort of mundane expression too. I imagine going on Craigslist and
Yeah,
seeing, right?
yeah,
Like a listing available. Oh, we lost our obligatory monstrous woman. We're interviewing for new positions. You must be able to elicit feelings of dread and desire. Make us feel
yes.
joyful when we punish you.
Because
Right?
I think it displaces our dread to regard it. And it functions, really in the same way. And we talked about this earlier also, but it functions in a very similar way to true crime, in that I think that we look to true crime. It's not all about bloodlust or morbid fascination. I think a lot of it is about mitigating what we are most afraid of being, or what we are
Mm,
most afraid of happening to us. I think it's a lot of, you know uh, there, but for the grace of God go I, to
yeah.
quote the good book, the AA book, I think. It really is about sort of differentiation of the self from the self's worst fears by virtue of, being in a separate body.
This like permissible safety by
Yes.
creating
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
separation.
Yes.
Totally. It's it's so juicy to think about too, and the physical experiences and sensations of that othering process
Mhm.
within ourselves, and I mean, I know that both that cultural conditioning towards shame works towards the way in which we desire to shame others, and also the way in which shame and that shaming of others and the shame we vicariously feel for shaming someone else creates this erogenous
Oh,
Ouroboros.
yes. It's like erotic triangulation between the self, the culture, and the other. I completely agree with that. I think that's very accurate.
And in this way, we actually counter to what we see in a lot of explicit horror cinema or literary horror. We actually really need and want the monster, right? We pretend that we don't. And I think in more typical kind of like slasher horror, you spend the whole time running away from the monster.
Right.
But the tabloid cultural monstrous woman teaches us, or rather reveals our own sort of hand about how much we love and want and crave and need monsters.
I really, really agree. And I think that, if you think about, again, I keep going back to these women that have killed their children. But if you think about the difference between the media craze that rose up around someone like Darlie Routier, who's on death row for she was convicted of murdering her two children, really proclaims her innocence. It's kind of neither here nor there. But if you think about how much media is generated around a figure like her or Susan Smith or Andrea Yates, versus there's a guy who's, and this just kind of proves the point, there's a man whose name I can't even remember, who I believe that he threw his two toddlers into a river in their car seats and then absconded to Mexico and then was eventually caught and tried and he's in prison. But it's the fact that we remember the mothers' names
Yeah.
because it is the monstrous feminine rather than this man who we just think like, oh, what an aberrant guy whose name I don't remember.
I
And
don't
there's
even
a
remember hearing that story anywhere.
yeah, I'll find a link and send it to you. But
Yeah.
it's really, I think, such a kind of profound assessment to know these names versus
Yeah.
the anonymity of a man who did nearly exactly the same thing.
It also shows sort of sort of I guess in an insulting way the lack of expectation we have for men to be good
Well,
fathers.
think about how many family annihilators names do you know? It's like Chris Watts because that
Yeah.
was recent. Maybe John List because that's really infamous one. But there are so many male family annihilators versus how many women kill their children because they have postpartum depression or
Right.
whatever else is going on, and um, they're not displayed culturally or socially in the same way. It's very different kind of like the female family annihilator becomes really a bigger symbol. It's not just it becomes like a symbol of like a profoundly diseased culture. That's what we hold it up as, which I think is really kind of fascinating.
And it shows that we value it as a better story.
We do because it's somehow more morally and emotionally insulting to us
Yeah.
that a woman could kill her children.
If we can't rely on a mother's love for her
Right,
children, what could we
right.
possibly rely on?
Right, which kind of brings us, full circle where, in the beginning of this conversation, I kind of said what's the most hated figure socially and culturally, and it's the bad mother. There's nothing more hated.
We end up seeing too, right? This coalescing of the monstrous woman, the bad mother, really under the same canopy of the cultural gaze as werewolves or vampires or strange
Yes.
aliens. It's
Oh,
they
yes.
haunt, they
Like
haunt and hunt alongside each other.
it's an abomination. The mother who murders her children is an abomination. In the same way, I think, we also don't like ungrateful women. So when you have,
Yeah.
a female cinema star or a pop star who seems ungrateful, it gets sort of, not that the categorization is the same, but it's kind of, cast under the same rubric where there's something repellent to us about that.
The only thing worse than no maternal instinct then is entitlement, right?
Right, right, right.
So we know some of the media which inspires you, which is media kind of writ large, right? but there have to be books or films or certain TV shows or magazines too that really initiated this sort of primordial fire of curiosity and maybe even obsession within you. And I'm curious if you wanted to share maybe some of
Oh,
those.
yes. I grew up in the 80s, so I really remember being in elementary school, and there were a couple of shows that would come on very late at night, and one of them was Hard Copy, and it was or Current Affair. One or the other had Maury Povich as the anchor person before he had a talk show. And I remember very well, I had a little black and white television in my room, and I would set an alarm and wake up. These shows would be on at, like, I don't know, 4 o'clock in the morning or something. And I remember watching an episode that had Robert Chambers on it, the preppy killer who murdered Jennifer Levin in Central Park in the 80s. And they'd somehow sourced this VHS tape of him pulling the heads off of Barbie dolls. And it was like, I've never seen it again. I remember it with perfect clarity. I know that it exists because I have looked on the internet and found other people have written about it. But it really, frightened me so badly. I think, there was this point as a child when I really, and maybe all kids kind of feel like this, I really wanted to be scared, and I really wanted to sort of ransack things that I wanted to see things I wasn't supposed to
Yeah.
see. So it started quite early. And then I think, when the internet came out, it sort of opened a lot up for me because my other passion is fandom. And so
Mhm.
at the dawn of the internet, there were all of these incredible fan run message boards, and often they would be devoted to deceased stars or musicians. And it was really fascinating for me. I think what I got out of that and how it influenced my work is that you saw how possible it is to relate to a stranger, and that's what fandom is, right? Which I think
Yeah.
we also spoke about earlier. This deep feeling of kinship with a stranger, and I sort of, I think, merged those two influences and thought, if a fan can relate to a celebrity in this kind of intrinsic, deeply personal way, can people also do that for crimes? And it's not
Mhm.
necessarily for the people that commit crimes, but I think there's some similar mechanism that translated. So it's the sort of crisscross between popular culture and then the sort of dark underbelly of regular culture, or even the dark underbelly of popular culture.
I'm obsessed with this idea of the parasocial attachment as its
Mm.
own monstrous entity, right?
Oh
This
yeah,
whole
yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of websites that used to be around that are gone now. So, I've always thought in my work, what's really important to me is I kind of want to be an archive for these things that sort of come through culture, sometimes very quickly, sometimes in a more protracted way, but then ultimately kind of disappear, which is why, I haven't written about Britney Spears because she's not disappearing. I like these
yeah.
things that are just kind of momentary blips on the radar of culture that get exsanguinated by sort of by our hunger. We drain them, and then it's like the husk left, and I want to go back into the husk,
Yeah.
and see what we took and kind of see what's left and see what we missed.
I mean, that's a very almost tender death doula of identity approach that I think is really endearing and sweet, and for all the ways in which this can be a profoundly devastating or troubling or surreal area of fascination or exploration. I mean, at the foremost of this kind of monster excavation for you is still like a radical love for the humanity of these people.
It reminds me the first time we met and I had a reading with you, and you said, "I'm looking at you and I see that you were in a room full of drowned women." And you said usually this would be really very negative. There would be something really ominous and scary about it, but somehow here it isn't. And I think it's because I do feel a great responsibility to try to recuperate some of these figures. I think, and I don't know if we talked about serial killers and why I'm not interested in them.
We
But
haven't.
I
I
think,
wanna know that though.
well, I think with a lot of that really gruesome, grotesque, gratuitous violence, there's no that's monstrous to me because there's no human mechanism behind it.
Yeah.
It's just wholesale slaughter. And I think that in the figures that I pick, the people that I want to write about, the women who have sometimes aired socially and sometimes aired legally and often aired morally, I always feel like there's a reason why, and that reason is just kind of latent and waiting to be found if people would look. So that's I want to look.
It's a really beautiful way of giving back to people that essentially gave their lives to feed us, right?
Yes,
Really.
yeah, yeah, in like a completely vampiric culture, yeah.
Yeah. And where we feast and devour and then move on to the next, fetid corpse that we can find.
Yes,
Here's
yeah,
Alyssa running up after us, waiting till everyone's dispersed and, taking care of and tending to the body so that
yeah,
the
yeah,
legacy can get
Undertaker,
preserved.
yeah.
Amazing. What do you have coming up? How can people find you? Where can people find you? Do you want people to find you? Is maybe a
Oh,
better
people can find me.
question.
I think that if you wanna find me, you look around and you'll find me. I have some big projects that I'm working on now that are kinda long term. I just sold a movie, so I'm writing
Oh
a
my god.
film right now.
Love
But
it.
yeah, I'm around.
That is super exciting. Well, I know I want for sure to have you back on. We can talk about I love the idea of this fandom monstrosity too, this
I'd love
weird.
to come back. My great passion, I would love to.
Yes, this the kind of collective jellyfish mycelium nature of fandom as
Yes,
an eco terror that we have yet to fully acknowledge. Obsessed with it. Love it.
here for it.
Amazing. Alyssa, this has been such a pleasure. You were a dream guest. I wish that we could do this literally for forever, but you're very busy and you also have a movie. So I will let it go now, but I can't wait to hear more from you and have you back.
I will be back. This was my great pleasure, Sasha. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, you have a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, eternal night, wherever it is, wherever you are. And I will talk to you next time on Sublime Beasts.